Pastor Doug here from Crossroads. It's great to be with you. I hope that today's message will draw you closer to Jesus.
Have you ever invested in something that ended up turning out to be completely worthless? Have you ever had that happen to you? The first thing that comes to mind for me is my sports card collection. Man, growing up in the 90s, I loved collecting sports cards. I had everything: football, baseball, basketball. I even had hockey cards. I had everything. I spent my allowance money on it. I spent birthday money on it. I got them for gifts. I got them for Christmas. I built a massive collection of sports cards. And then I would take those sports cards and I meticulously organized them. I organized them into folders and categories and value. I would spend time looking up to see which ones were worth more and which ones were worth less. I protected them and I saved them because I was convinced that these things were going to be worth a tremendous amount of money someday. And I had some reason to think that because I grew up with stories of my dad telling me of all the cards he had when he was growing up, of all the famous players that he had cards of that he didn't save. In fact, he used them like as spokes on his bicycle when he was riding around. And those cards would be worth huge amounts of money today. So I was convinced that I was not going to make that same mistake. I was not going to do it. I was going to save mine. I was going to collect them. I was going to protect them. And they were going to be worth so much money. Boy, was I wrong. Oh, man, I was wrong. See, what I did not realize at the time was the era that I was collecting cards was the most overproduced era in sports cards collecting. There were tons of everything. Nothing was worth anything. On top of which, right after I was done collecting, the trading card market kind of collapsed for a number of years. I mean, it's a little bit of a revival now, but it's still not what it was. Also, as a kid, you don't realize that like 15 years down the road, like nobody cares about any of those players anymore. Very few players actually are good enough to transcend eras that people still want their stuff 15 years later. So I started to get the sense that these things were not going to be worth anything, but I still held on to them on the faint hope that might be they would still be worth something. So fast forward to 2021, we're getting ready to move. I'm getting rid of stuff. I'm clearing out storage, and I come back to my card collection that is still sitting there. Meantime, they've been in the basement of our apartment building. I get them all out, and so many of them have been degraded, eroded. The humidity made some of them like stick together. They were in pretty bad shape, and I'm like, this is not good. I'm like, is it time to pull the plug on these things finally? But before I did that, I decided to go visit a trading card store and like talk to one of the experts. So I basically walked in and said, hey, are these things ever going to be worth anything? And he just kind of looked at me and was like, no, no, they really aren't. So I finally decided that it was time to let go of most of these cards. This investment that I spent time and energy and money on for years and stored them for a long time, I had to come to the acknowledgement that they turned out to be of no lasting value and made virtually no impact. Has it ever happened to you? Have you had something like that? Maybe it wasn't sports cards for you. Maybe it was Beanie Babies. That was a nice trend for a while. Thought those things were going to be worth something. Or maybe it's different. Maybe you're a lottery person, and it's like the next one is going to be the one. But whatever the case is, you were probably sure that investment was going to pay off, but then it never really did. You were sure it was going to be worth it, but it turns out it really wasn't. So there's a question that this brings up that matters more than the worth of old baseball cards or even Beanie Babies, and that's this. What does God actually want us to do with our money? What does God actually want us to do with our money? What should we invest in? And how can we make sure that we're using the money we've been given wisely? So we're going to spend the next 2 weeks talking about just that. We're going to be looking at a surprising definition of faithfulness when it comes to money. We're going to look at what it looks like to make an impact with your money. and what it looks like to make wise kingdom investments. So as we jump in, it may or may not surprise you that Jesus actually talks quite a bit about money. He wasn't shy about talking about it, and he had many, many interesting things to say. So the particular passage we're going to spend most of our time in this morning is in Matthew. Jesus tells a story. It's about money, but it's about so much more than money as well. This is a story that's so deep and wide-ranging with so many implications, many of which are very surprising and rather challenging. I'm hoping that this one will challenge you about how you think and use the financial resources that you've been given. So we're going to be in Matthew 25. And just a little bit of background on this particular passage. In this part of Matthew, it's a part of a series of stories that Jesus is telling about the kingdom of heaven. And Matthew recorded these stories, wrote them down. And this particular one is a parable, which means it's a story that Jesus was telling everybody because it was something that was meant to tell us something about what God is like, about what he expects, and about the reality of the world. So the particular story we're going to start with is Matthew 25. We're going to be in verse 14. So let's take a look. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, it being the kingdom of heaven, will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. So right off the bat, we see there is a man who calls his servants in. The man is going to go out on a journey. Now, in this story, since this is a parable, we need to know who is actually who here. So the man going on a journey is actually God. That's what the comparison here is. The man going on the journey is going to be God in this story, and the servants are going to be those of us who followers of Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are related to the characters of the servants here. So the master comes in, he calls in his servants, and before he leaves, he starts distributing his wealth around. He goes all Scrooge McDuck and starts handing out bags of money to everybody. And you're talking about actual money. He's actually handing out money here. And right from the beginning of this story, we're going to get our first key big idea about money that Jesus is telling us. Right from the start here, Jesus is going to give us a radical reframe about money. And that's this. You are the manager, not the owner. You're the manager, not the owner. In this story, the wealth belonged to the master, and he distributed it to the servants. And it's the same thing here. It's not our money. The resources we have are not ours. They're actually God's. And he is the master who has entrusted those particular resources and that particular money to us. That is how God sees it. God sees our finances, that he is the owner, and we are the servants, we are the managers who have been entrusted with those particular resources. Now, if we stop for a minute, if we take that idea seriously, that changes everything about how we handle it. Think about the condition of your car right now, the interior of your car. Some of you might be meticulously clean. Some of you other ones, not so much. Now, think about how you handle your personal vehicle. Let's say you borrowed somebody else's car. When you return somebody else's car, is it going to end up in the same condition as your personal vehicle? Or are you going to take care of it differently? If you borrow someone's car, you're not necessarily going to floor it like you do with your car. You're not going to abuse it. You're not going to leave fast food wrappers all over. You might even refill it with gas afterwards. Why? Because it's not your car. In that moment, you're just managing it. And it's the same idea with our finances. If we take it seriously that we are the managers of our money and not the owners, it changes how we handle it. Now, maybe at this point you're thinking, maybe this story is just not even for me. I am not rich. Nobody has come in the last few weeks and just dropped a bag of gold on my front porch and said, here, take care of this for me. That hasn't happened. Well, let me just tell you right off the bat, no matter what your level of finances is, Jesus would have been speaking to a very mixed audience when he told this story. He'd have been talking to all kinds of people from all kinds of walks of life that had various financial situations. So is this story just for certain people? No, it's for everybody. And one more thing. As we talk about the story, you could use this parable and the bags of gold to talk about all kinds of gifts and all kinds of talents that God has given us beyond simply money. We could use it to talk about time. We could use it to talk about talents. We could use it to talk about other treasures. Or since Doug hasn't been here in a long time, or treasures. If you're new, you'll get that in a couple weeks. But he talked about money for a specific reason. And he wants us to focus on it. So let's focus on the money aspect this morning. Now back to verse 15. The master starts giving out bags of gold. Now how does he distribute the bags of gold? He distributes them according to ability. What ability? We aren't told what ability. Maybe it's experience. Maybe it's talent with money. Maybe some of them had more talent with money. Maybe it was just simply the level of trust that the master had in those particular servants. But whatever it was, the master determined some criteria for distribution based on his judgment and some kind of level of merit. He didn't distribute it equally. Just as today, we know wealth and money aren't distributed equally. Now, there's a lot more implications here that we could get into or interesting questions that could come up, but that's going to take us too far afield. But in one aspect, one thing we need to be aware of is in the modern era, we can tend to focus very heavily on comparing amounts that one person has to amounts another person has. But what we see here is that's not the focus of the master in this story, as we're going to see. So suffice it to say, while each servant did not get the exact same amount, each servant got something. Each servant got something that they were responsible for managing. And it's the same with us. We may not have as much as somebody else does, but we've all been given something that God has asked us to manage, something that he has entrusted us with individually. So now the man leaves, and he puts in servants in charge of the money. And we're going to skip down to the point at which the master comes back to evaluate what happened here. So in verse 19 it says this: after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The master comes back and he wants to know what happened with his money. Of course. It makes perfect sense. You start distributing bags of gold, you want to know what happens to it. So that's our next key point. The next key point we have to understand about money is this, is that we will be held accountable for what we do with the financial resources we've been given. Each one of us is going to be held accountable for what we've done with what we've been given. So now we get to find out what each of those servants did with the money that they were entrusted. They give their reports back to the master about what they've been doing. So starting in verse 20, it says this: the man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. So the servant with 5 bags of gold doubles his master's investment. He puts that money to work. It says earlier in the passage, he did it immediately. He was willing to risk it on behalf of the master, and it yielded a very nice return. And what was the master's response to this? The master says, well done, good job. And he describes the servant as good and faithful. And then he rewards him. He said, I am going to increase your authority. I am going to increase your scope of influence, and you get to share in my happiness. So let's check in on the servant with 2 bags of gold. Let's see how he did. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. So the second servant doubles that money as well. He was willing to risk it as well on behalf of the master. And the master's response, once again, well done. You are good and faithful. I will increase your scope of influence. I will increase your authority. Share in the master's happiness. Now, what we have to notice here is something really interesting. He gets the exact same response from the master as the one who doubled the 5 bags, doesn't he? And this is important. This is not something to overlook. The master is just as happy with the servant who had 2 bags of gold that he doubled as he was with the one who doubled 5. Even though the servant with 2 bags garnered less than half of the return that the other one did. He's just as happy with that particular servant as well. The master may not have distributed the resources in the same way, but this is the thing. The master doesn't care about the total amount. He cares about what they did with it. He cares about what they did with it. See, these 2 servants understood their role. They weren't spending the money for themselves. They were investing it on behalf of the master. They were faithful stewards of the money they'd been given. And this is going to be really important when we get to the servant with 1 bag. So now, based on the story so far, we can deduce that God is pleased and in fact considers it faithful when we take what money we've been given and are willing to risk it on behalf of God in order to create a return and in order to create impact for Him. In fact, in this story, doing just this is what Jesus calls good. It generates rewards. It generates opportunities for those who did it. Multiplying the financial resources and impact of the resources you've been given is what it means to be faithful with our money. Let that sink in for a moment. So let me ask you this. If Jesus were to say to you, if he were going to look over your finances, not to scold you in any way, but as someone who has trusted you with something on purpose, what would he have to say? Would he say, well done, good and faithful servant? Or would he have something else to say? It's not a guilt trip, but an invitation into what God is planning and what God is going to do. So let's look at how the third servant handled it. How did the third servant handle his 1 bag of gold? Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, investing where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. Now, there are several things here. The servant with 1 bag of gold handled things very differently than the other 2 servants. Why? Well, it says right here, he did it out of fear. Fear. He had told himself a story about the master that leads him to be more preoccupied with messing up with the master's money than with trying to do anything with it, anything with what he'd been given. And that fear of failure made him unwilling to take chances, unwilling to take risks with what he'd been entrusted. So let me tell you a story that might help us around this. My first year of playing college basketball, I was new to the team. I was new to that level of play. In fact, I was still fairly new to basketball in general. So I spent most of my first season in college basketball on the bench. I would get a minute or two here or there at the end of the half or the end of games that are kind of blowouts and weren't really anything. Then later in the season, we're playing a conference opponent on the road, and it's a close game. And the coach looks down at the end of the bench, and he looks down, and he's going to put a sub in, and he looks right at me and calls my name. And my eyes must have gotten huge. I'm like, what? Wait, what? You're calling me? You're calling me? I was shocked. I did not expect my name to be called in that moment. This was like a game that actually mattered. And so I'm like sheepishly getting up to walk over to check into the game. And I'm so nervous at this point. I am so worried about screwing it up. I have not been in a game like this before. I was worried I was going to mess everything up. So I get out on the court, and because I was so nervous and so worried about this, I was just passing the ball. It would come to me, I would just get rid of it. I wasn't doing anything whatsoever with the ball when it came to me. Finally, after a couple of minutes of this, coach calls a timeout. The whole team gathers around. We're in the huddle, and I'm waiting for him to say what he's going to say. He just looks right at me. He's like, I did not put you in this game for you to do nothing. If you do not do something right now, you are going back to the bench. I'm like, okay. All right, I got it. And that kind of shook me out of it. I managed to score on our next 2 possessions. So I was happy about that. But my fear of the coach and my fear of messing it all up led me to squander that opportunity that he was giving me initially. And it actually is what led to my coach's wrath at me. And this is what's going to happen here to the first bag servant, the one with only 1 bag. The master is going to get mad at him because he was not taking advantage of the opportunity. Verse 26. His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I harvested where I have not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. What was the master's response to this? He calls him wicked. He calls him lazy. Now this is fascinating. Now this servant didn't lose the money. He wasn't the prodigal son. He didn't spend it. He didn't gamble it away. He didn't lose it. He didn't steal it. Yet he gets called wicked and lazy. Why is that? Again, because it wasn't about the amount. It was about the mindset. It was about what he was willing to do and what he was willing to, chances he was willing to take with what he'd been given. He didn't make any attempt to invest it, to grow it, to make it better. He didn't take what he was given and run with the opportunity. He sat on it and he did nothing with the opportunity. Are we clear on this? If we want to be faithful with the money and the resources we've been given, we need to put them to work, to multiply them, to create return, to create impact for God. However, if we hoard the money, if we hoard the resources, if we're too afraid to use them, if we're too worried about messing up, or if we're too focused on what we don't have and what somebody else does have, then we risk God viewing us as wicked or lazy. And if that's not harsh enough, we get next is one of the most astonishing statements in the New Testament from Jesus. In verse 29, it says this: "For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have, will be taken from them." Now, this is a hard statement for many modern people to take. It kind of goes against our collective notions of fairness. You mean you're taking from people who have less? You mean you're giving it to people who have more? What's going on here? Well, let's go back to the basketball analogy and the basketball story that we talked about earlier. What would have happened if I hadn't responded to my coach's challenge to do something? What would happen if I had not responded? If I'd continued wasting the minutes on the court he had given me? He would have put the starters back in. He would have put back in the players who already had lots of minutes. And the minutes that I had, those few minutes I had, would have been completely taken away from me. Why? Because there was a game to win. There was a game to win. And coach needed players who were going to take full advantage of the minutes that were given them in order to accomplish the goal of winning the game. And it's the same thing in the kingdom of God. What this is saying is this: if we want to boil it down real simply, if you don't use it, you might lose it. If you don't use it, you might lose it. Why? Because God has a mission that he's trying to accomplish. He's trying to reach each and every person. He's trying to draw them to himself. He wants to win souls to him. And he's looking for faithful servants who will be excellent stewards of the resources that he's given them and are on mission. And in case you weren't sure if Jesus was really serious about this, he has one last thing to say about this one servant. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In this one statement, we see the deep disappointment discussed. Jesus is not messing around here. Now, this might seem harsh, but it's because the master is passionate about his mission. God isn't careless. God isn't cruel. He's entrusted us with resources because he's serious about reaching people. And he wants us as his partners to be serious with him about that same goal. Now, why does God want us to multiply our resources? What does it look like to even multiply our resources? I mean, are we all supposed to just become stockbrokers? Are we all supposed to marry into the royal family? Are we all supposed to just go out and become pirates and look for buried treasure? Not quite. That's not quite what we're getting at here. The goal here is not simply gaining money for money's sake. It's about the mission. It's about creating impact. So let's look quickly at another word from Jesus that might help us. Matthew 6:19 says this, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal." Multiplying your financial resources is primarily about what you do with the money you've been given. We can put it to work in two different ways. We can use it for ourselves, we can use it for things that don't last, or we can use it for the kingdom of God. We can use it for mission. What are those things that would help us be on mission? People. Use it to help people. Use it to fund the work of the church and the greater work of the kingdom of God. Now, there's a story that will kind of help us all tie it all together here. Many of you are familiar with Rick Warren. He's the founding pastor of Saddleback Church. And when he was young and newly married, he had little or no money. And at that point, he made a pre-decision with his wife. They made a pre-decision. We talked about pre-deciding last week. But Rick made a pre-decision that they were going to increase their amount of giving every single year. Now, some years they had very little money, and their increase was just a fraction of a percent more. But they did this year over year consistently. They gave more of their money away. They stuck with their commitment. Now, fast forward a couple decades. Rick Warren ends up writing The Purpose-Driven Life. And it becomes one of the biggest selling books of all time. It's one of the most translated books outside of the Bible in history. It was huge. As a result, it produced huge, huge revenue. Now, when reflecting on the amount of money that this book made, Warren had this to say. He said, "Why did God allow me to write one of the best-selling books of all time? He did it because he knew what I would do with the money." He had a 20-year track record of being faithful with little, so God was willing to give him much. He didn't change his lifestyle upon this. In fact, he'd started declining his salary from his church, and he instituted something called reverse tithing, where he lived off 10% and gave away 90% of what he was making to the works of the church and various other charitable causes. Rick Warren multiplied his resources. He then turned around and used those resources to create greater impact and put that money to work for the kingdom. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for you? Now, maybe you are great at investing and making money. Awesome. Make lots of money, give it away. Put it to work for the kingdom of God. Help other people who are struggling with their finances. Multiply the impact that you can potentially have. Maybe for you, this looks like growing and expanding your business, providing jobs and livelihoods and opportunities and purpose for the people who work for you. Provide a good or service that really helps people and that people want and need. Be generous with what you've been given. Maybe it looks like taking that first step and starting to tithe for the first time or to increase your giving level. Maybe it means working extremely hard and getting promoted at work and getting that bonus or getting that raise. And then instead of using it for yourself, finding a cool way to invest it in the kingdom of God, in a mission, or in a new startup that you really love what they do. There was an interesting story. I had a personal encounter with this where I was trying to raise funds for a missions trip and it wasn't going very well. And then one of the other couples who was on the mission trip didn't have a lot of money themselves. They were not by any means wealthy, but they got an unexpected check in the mail one day. And they decided, we're not going to use that for ourselves. And they gave a huge chunk of it to me to help fund me on my mission trip. So it doesn't matter what your income level is. You can find creative opportunities, creative ways to use the resources you've been giving to make an impact for the kingdom. So let me ask you this. What kind of return on impact are you seeing in your life right now? What would happen if you were to take what God has already given you and just pray this, Lord, I want to put this to work for you. Multiply it. Use it for your kingdom. What would happen if we prayed that prayer? You might not know what that full path looks like, but you can start by making one decision. If you want to respond today, on your connection card, there's a couple ways. Maybe the thing you need to do is you need to ask God to help you see yourself as a money manager and not a money owner. Or maybe for you say, you know what, I'm going to commit to faithfully multiplying my financial resources. I'm going to find something, I'm going to do one thing that's going to help me to invest that, to create a greater impact. When it comes to money, we haven't all been entrusted with the same amount. But God has entrusted each and every one of us with something. And we are managers of that, not owners. So let's be like the faithful servants, and let's faithfully put God's financial resources to work, to multiply them, to invest them, to grow them, so that we can have a greater impact for the kingdom of God.
Thanks again for listening. Any step you take towards Jesus is a step in the right direction. You can find out more about us at crbic.org. That's crbic.org.